I would like to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Priscila Freire and Laura Grimes will be joining us. I'm going to introduce Dr. Freire, and I'm going to have Laura introduce herself later on because she knows herself the best. Well, that's fun. As a clinical social worker, Dr. Freire has worked with diverse families, individuals, and children in a variety of settings using various modalities for over 15 years. She has managed a number of interpersonal violence programs, including the Family Violence Intervention Program, the Safe and Sober Program, and the Southside Teens About Respect, a teen dating violence prevention program. Other areas of expertise include work with Latino aggressors of domestic violence and cross-cultural issues in counseling, including migration and intergenerational family dynamics. She has been teaching at Loyola since 2007. Her courses include the Family Violence class, Cultural Diversity, and Family Assessment and Intervention, among others. Her research interests focus on intimate partner violence across diverse populations, age groups, and cross-cultural practice. It's my absolute honor to introduce my colleague and my friend, Dr. Priscila Freire.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, so nice. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the presentation today. We are really excited to offer the topic on cultural competency. We kind of talked a little bit about what to cover in such a broad topic. I mean, you could cover just about anything under that, right? And oftentimes it's confusing to even understand what the person means when they say that, because there's so much it could be discussed. And so in talking with Laura, we agreed that the topic of gender variance is one that is not only important and relevant, but it's something that we don't often get a lot of information about. The research keeps growing on some of these communities, but this is a community that still lags a little bit behind in terms of the knowledge base. And so it behooves us as professionals to obviously learn as much as we can about the people that we serve or the people that we could potentially serve. And that is part of cultural competency. And so we wanted to, Laura, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself before we kind of jump into the agenda? Come here.
Sure, why not? Good morning. My name is Laura Grimes. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I went to Loyola many years ago and did not think that I would end up doing what I'm doing now. I'm in private practice and I'm a sex therapist. And I have a specialty in working with gender variant populations and around alternative sexualities. So I work around gender variance quite a lot, and usually that is people who are talking about transitioning in some way. Although I've been doing it long enough and we know more enough about it as time has passed and it's become more relevant socially that we have a traditional model of how we have seen gender, and we have a more modern model of looking at gender variance, not just as an M box and an F box, but it's a continuum just like sexual orientation is. And it affects people in a multitude of ways. The people who are gender variant are not the same as cisgendered people any more than people who are gay are the same as straight people. And so the more people that are coming out and are being more open about how they identify, and the more that our culture is changing around the needs of people, the more that we're seeing clients talking about these issues. And so I'm going to talk about that at the last half of the presentation on gender variant clients and kind of the impact that that has with people.
All right. So the agenda for today is that my section will be to look at broad strokes, sort of kind of a review, so that everybody, we're using all the terms in a way that everybody knows what we mean by that, not because you haven't been exposed to it, but it's just because we want to make sure that we have a common language today. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about some concepts that help us sort of at least conceptually understand some of the material that we're talking about today. And as you know, and as Laura was talking about, the environment itself is changing at leaps and bounds. And for those of you who work with youth especially, I mean, it's very different. The environment of exploration and of, sort of the new norm, if you may, for a lot of people is to talk about gender very fluidly. So this is something that can be hopefully helpful to you in your practice. And also in the context of supervising students, obviously, who will be following your lead on a lot of these concepts and the work with these clients. So I'll be talking about that part, and then as Laura was saying, she'll be narrowing it down. So I start really broad, talk about cultural competency, and then she'll narrow it down to a specific community, I would say communities, because as any community, there's a lot of diversity within communities. And then we'll kind of try to end with applying a lot of this material on a case study so that you can take with you sort of this idea of what it would look like in actual practice. How do we want to do questions? They stop us anyway, anytime, right? I would think, informal that way. Is that okay? So I want to first say that in terms of cultural competency, we've talked about this to death, and for those of you who are trained helpers, which are all of you, that we all have been exposed to at least the importance of cultural competency theoretically and hypothetically. It's something that is not only sort of consistent with our professional values, our ethical expectations, but it just helps us be consistent with the principles of the social work profession, which is to start where the client is. And so we know that there's a lot written out there about what it should be, what it should not be, what's included, but what's get confusing is sometimes it's defined as race or ethnicity. Those are the primary, when you think of cultural competency, for sure, those are the two default people that the places that are factors or identities that most people default to. Nothing wrong with that. Certainly they are part of cultural competency as well. We're trying to kind of broaden that thinking to include race and ethnicity, of course, with these communities as well as transgender, because again, when we talk about cultural competency, we tend to focus on one factor. And so when we talk about trans or LGBTQ communities, we're talking about sexual orientation. Or when we talk about Black people or Latino people or whatever, Asian people, we're talking about race and ethnicity. And so we forget, and that's why we wanted to make sure to talk about intersectionality, which I will in a little bit, to look at the totality of the person, the totality of that person's humanity, not just slivers of it, as if that sliver didn't inform the rest of the slivers, and that the rest of the slivers didn't inform or give a individual experience to that person, and that experience, of course, gets affirmed or not, depending on what the dominant environment messaging is, or the message is about what is the norm. So looking at NASW cultural competency standards, however, our profession has decided that these are the elements that we want to look at when we're thinking about cultural competency. So, of course, ethics and values of the profession, and that involve being responsive, if you are not able to work with somebody for whatever reason, it's our ethical responsibility to make sure that that person receives the services that they need if we're not able to do that. It does not mean, of course, that we say, I don't agree with your lifestyle, so I'm gonna, I can't work with you. That would be probably not the letter of the law, but it's certainly the spirit of the code of ethics that we would be at least recognizing our limitations. And then, of course, the more professional, sort of the bigger good, if you may, of the profession would be that you would nudge yourself professionally to want to learn and to want to grow, even if you didn't totally agree or even understood that community. Because, like I tell students, we all have our values, of course, our personal values and individual limitations, and it's sort of how we navigate that makes us really professionals or not, because it's the idea that, and you will be you are in the role of facilitating that knowledge and that sort of that curiosity, and hopefully helping that to not only encourage that curiosity, but also sort of help them with that curiosity when it comes to their cultural competency growth. So there's always, usually in the literature and elsewhere, usually there's an element of self-awareness. That's very Western, the self-awareness part, that if you're not self-aware first in some ways, that you're not going to be able to change your behavior. In my experience, that's not necessarily true. I mean, sometimes you can be self-aware, but your behavior stays the same. And so the one doesn't necessarily lead to the other. And so it's something to be mindful of in your supervisor role. That you, of course, start somewhere by encouraging and supporting, but sometimes the behaviors still don't change, and our behaviors need to be looked at as well. So the cross-cultural knowledge, that has been a challenge for the profession, and we're not unique in that. Most professions, helping professionals, really struggle with this because, and how to teach it is especially, has been challenging as a profession, because we've gone from everything from not talking a little bit about it to wanting to talk about it to then when we talk about it as distinct categories. Like we talk about Latinos eat this way and dance this way and talk this way, and we would talk African Americans, they eat this way, they talk this way, and they parent this way. And so kind of the term in academic terms is we essentialize, we make something that's complex very simplistic, and then we stereotype as a society. And sometimes our profession has done that too, not with the intent of stereotyping, but more like struggling with how to actually teach about diversity when there's so many individual differences, right? So the challenge then becomes, how can we talk about this big, very diverse group that they have certain commonalities for sure, but then how do we capture all the differences? And so you see that in the progression of how we talk about cultural competency. And the one area that is sort of my mantra to always bring to the table is class. We hardly ever talk about class as a variable in cultural competency, and it's such an important one because you cannot compare a highly educated, middle-class, Latino, African American to somebody who's not. Completely different. They're both African American, they both have pride about who they are, but totally different experiences. And so when we lump people together, it sort of becomes our challenge to how do we sort of use the knowledge, because then the other side of the coin, going to the other extreme, would be, what do we do with our knowledge? I mean, is that knowledge then not useful because it's so broad and so, well, I wouldn't go that far. I think that we need to, that's where our critical thinking skills come in and say, okay, how do I use this information in a way that's responsive on the ground? And also, how do I stay open to be able to really recognize that everybody can speak of their own experience, really? We can study them like rats or whatever. We can try to describe their behaviors, but at the end of the day, it's that individual's personal experience and how they experience their humanity through race, ethnicity, class, and all these factors that really is where we need to start from. So it's sort of a ground up, or sort of a, in research they call the participatory action research approach, which is sort of gathering the information on the ground and then informing your practice that way. That's a very key aspect of learning. So then, from the knowledge, we assume that we can develop at least some form of skill set. And in the academic setting, we obviously have to assume that because we have to teach something. But we know in the social work profession that there's an intellectual aspect and then there's an actual experiential aspect. And that's where you come in. And that's why we value what you do so much. Not only from Loyola's perspective, but as a profession, because you are really key to kind of bring home all of this content and make it real. Because a lot of students, as you probably have very many stories about this, a lot of students are really good in the classroom and can really be great writers, they can conceptualize, they can express themselves very impressively, but then when it comes to the, integrating that into practice with a person sitting in front of them, then that's really where they struggle the most. Or some people backwards, they're really good with the people skills part, but then the conceptualization part is not as strong. And so your role is kind of how to integrate both, sort of the intellectual aspects, but then the experiential aspects. So it's a really, really important role. But we recognize also that there's other elements of practice, of cross-cultural, I should say, cultural competency that are really important. We don't work in a vacuum. We don't practice in a vacuum. individually, neither of us live in a vacuum as well. I mean, we are not neutral in what we bring to the table as field instructors and as instructors and social workers. And so the workforce, the environment of the agency, of the program, where your agency program is located, in the neighborhood that you're located, in the city that you're located, rural, urban, I mean, you know, we can pile on all the factors that really bring a different experience to not only to clients, but the experience of providing services in the context of, you know, sort of the environment that we're in, where there's a lot of cutbacks, and as a society, we're not valuing some of us feel that the work that we do is not as highly valued as other things. And so all of these elements, according to the LCSW, maintaining a professional education and learning how to communicate in ways that are, again, this is where it gets tricky, but culturally, learning about communication and the differences in communication, and not assuming that the way we approach things is the only way. I think that most people who are here and in social work profession get that. I mean, you know, because you get that in your practice, you understand that very well, and you have experience. But for students, you know, who are coming in brand new, who have a lot of passion and idealism, and I think that's the part that I love the most about a lot of the students that come in and they just, you know, they're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and just want to conquer the world. I love that energy. And so how to contain that, or I would say not necessarily contain in the sense of control, but in the sense of channeling it in ways where they're most helpful for their learning, is part of your role as well. And so these are some of the things what I wanted to do next was to talk about cultural competency in the sense of evaluating, because I'm very aware that this is an area that all of you are evaluating when you evaluate students' progress in field. So part of your field evaluation, there's a section about diversity, and it's very broad. And so I thought, well, why don't we, as part of talking about cultural competency, why don't we sort of operationalize that? Why don't we sort of clarify what in those categories, what we're talking about as hopefully as a helpful tool to you as when you approach the evaluation of the student. So what do we mean? What are the things, the skill sets, the knowledge base that you should be looking for when you evaluate these students? And hopefully in our classrooms, we're working with you on this. And so one category is to recognize the extent to which cultures sort of the bigger structures can create limitations to certain groups. And I think when I teach these classes, one of the things that I work with students is their strong feelings about, you know, learning about some of these concepts, because you know, they're so, race is such a charged type of topic in the United States, especially not unique to the United States, but we work and live in the United States. And so it's one of those things that people already come to the table with a certain level of trepidation. And so one of the things that we try to teach them is that we're not talking about you individually only, because people tend to feel like defensive, like, well, I'm not, my family is not, we've never been, I was never taught that. And of course that's great. You know, that's not what the conversation is about. It's more about, you know, we live in a society that has traditionally favored some groups over others, and the institutions that you know, some groups benefit from institutions more than others, and so it's bigger. So individually, people might not, you know, be discriminatory or racist or, you know, behave in racist ways. By living in a society that favors, you know, some groups over others, we're benefiting. So while we might not be actively, you know, racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever, by the fact that many of us belong to multiple dominant groups, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. We benefit in some way or another, and so that benefit gives us privilege over other people. And we have to call it that because that's what it is. And so when we teach the students that, they really have to muddle through that understanding that we're not talking about them only as individuals. We're talking about the fact that as a group, certain groups definitely benefit more than others. Some groups have many more barriers than others, and that's just the way the society is set up. There's a long history of that. This is not a history class, so we don't have to go through that, but there's a very long tradition of those structures being in place for specific reasons, usually economic, political. We often decided who to let in, and we're still struggling with that. Who do we let in, who do we not let in? And so all of those have deep, political and social impact. And so we're all exposed to those same messages. Of course, if you're part of dominant groups, those privileges sometimes are invisible to you because you don't have to think about it. That's why it's a privilege. And so those are the things that we're teaching students to be more mindful of. Not to feel guilty, not to feel like you have to, it's your fault. But we do have to acknowledge, if we can start at a place where we can acknowledge that we have those privileges, and we can build from there and be able to then understand better where other people are coming from who do not have those privileges. So this next one is about looking at our own personal biases, and this is something that is very common in teaching about cultural competency, that we're talking about the fact that we're not neutral players in the game, that yes, we might have learned, some of us more than others, about how important it was to be objective and, not to, make personalized things and all of that. And I think that after a lot of these postmodern ideas came in that made us aware, and feminist thinking as well, they made us aware that we really can't be completely neutral. That's just unrealistic. I mean, we carry our personhood wherever we go. We don't just leave it at home because we're going to be at work now. We carry everything that we bring to the table wherever we go. And so because of that, we have to be mindful of what we bring, because by not doing that, by not examining those what we bring to the table, then they become invisible to us. And that's how privilege and dominance continues in the context of cultural competency. If we don't look at dominant groups, then they don't get examined, and that's how dominance continues. So then we look at the process, the therapeutic process. So we have these broad strokes, and then how do we sort of narrow that down, or how do we integrate a lot of those ideas and principles into the actual therapeutic process that we're trying to teach students to go through? And so a lot of you have, I didn't take a poll based on where the settings that you're coming from, but of course you would adapt as clearly depending on what the setting and your role in that setting will be as a student. But the idea, of course, is you're mindful that this whole process can be imbued, every point of the therapeutic process you need to be mindful of the cultural implications and your expectations, your assumptions. And sometimes it's not just yours, it's the program's. So we all probably have experienced funders who have very clear ideas of what they're funding and very clear expectations of what they're funding, and they'll even actually tell you how to measure success and what they're expecting, and this is what it looks like, and you have to report back to me these categories, right? And so when that happens, it could be easily obscured the cultural competency part, because we're so focused, understandably, on trying to meet those those goals, that we might forget that the funder itself, that way that grant or that funding was conceptualized, can also be problematic. So some examples could be to use definitions of mental health, or define certain behaviors as mentally ill or mental healthy, and you're working primarily with underserved populations. And you probably know the research is very strong on how often underserved populations and minority populations often get more severely receive diagnoses that are more severe mental illness than the regular population. And so oftentimes their diagnoses are much more severe, and it begs the question: does it mean that there's more mental illness among ethnic communities? I don't think so. So I mean, there clearly are, obviously, but not to support the numbers that we're seeing. And so in here we're looking at, again, the kind of working down upward, because so we look at the conceptualization of the profession, we look on how to implement that in the therapeutic process, but then we need to recognize that the programs and organizations are not neutral either, if you think about it. We do have a purpose. Hopefully it's a good purpose. The purpose is to serve, and to serve certain communities, whatever your role can be. It's to better people, right? Hopefully. So in that sense, we have a commonality. But there could be, I've seen agencies have to close down because they weren't flexible enough to move with the changes of the times, or be able to be responsive to the needs of their community. So their community changed, and they were so entrenched that this is the type of community they serve, that then they had to close down and they stopped getting their funding. And so this can happen at multiple levels, and I'm approaching this intentionally this way because we don't want to just make it about you two, you and the supervisee. You're working within a context, and that context influences you, for sure, in the sense of cultural competency. So we also want to look at the way that these experiences brought on by the social environment impact the individual experiences of you, of students, and of course of the clients that are served. And that's why we really wanted to make it an intersectional, using an intersectional lens, because that intersectional lens, which I will talk in brief, attempts to capture a lot more complexity in trying to understand the layered experiences that people bring to the table. So hopefully they want to also, in terms of cultural competency, social workers want to look at themselves as constantly learning and opening to learning, and being, gauging some of that learning also from the ground. So you go to school, you get all this information, but then you have to see how that information works in the real world. I'll never forget, in the context of my profession, that I was told that you had to do, or sort of professionally, that the best practice was to do things in a specific way, until, informed by clients, I came to find out that that was not the best way. And maybe you have your own stories of that too. It's like, well, wait a minute, this is the way I learned it, and so all of a sudden, what I learned, if to put it a visual, this box that I learned doesn't fit in this particular situation, so now what do I do? It's clearly not fitting. And it's not just because I'm seeing things or whatever. The client is telling me it's not fitting. That vision, that description, that explanation, that however you want to do it, use it or express it, is not describing their experience. So I know that I've encountered that many times in practice, that it was always an aha moment, to be honest, a humbling moment too, to always remember that we can bring something to the table, but really people are experts of their own lives, and we have to be sort of culturally humble that way. And so in terms of the theories that we use, I teach this to students as well. Theories are also created by human beings. They're not made out of, yes, clearly they were special people in the sense that they had a good idea, right? And they were able to formulate this idea, pull it together, these ideas in a cohesive manner that then resulted in a theory, but it's humanly made. So as anything humanly made, it has limitations. And so do we throw away the theories? Absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying at all. But that's when we need to use our critical thinking skills to recognize that theories were created by people who also had a social location, who also had a race, who also had a class, who also had experiences that maybe don't reflect necessarily, the experiences of other people that we're trying to apply this theory to. Does that make sense? That seemed like a little convoluted in my thought, but okay. So we want to be able to recognize the value of theoretical frameworks and how to use them, but also recognizing that those theories might need some infusing of cultural competency or understanding of how the cultures are informing the lives of those folks in a way that then you need to make adjustments and to be most responsive. So this is a more advocacy piece of our role that a lot of us feel a lot of passion about. Which is not just, okay, we like a clinical degree. A lot of the students that come to Loyola, that's why they come to Loyola, because they want a clinical degree specifically. And so they really look forward when they meet with you and the concepts of your agencies, because that's really what brought them to social work. I mean, they are excited. They want to learn, and they understand that that's part of being a professional, because like I tell them, well, otherwise, what would be the difference between you and the nice church lady that just puts a table on the corner? I mean, she has nice feelings too, and she wants to help. But the difference is that you have theory and research to sort of support all these ideas. There's a body of knowledge that informs your work, that it's not just you winging it or feels good or just feels right. It's more informed than that. But we want to be able to recognize that the environment that we live in does have limitations that impact people's lives. So in terms of the research about cultural competency in the context of supervision, we see that the way a lot of the research looks at it is looking at when the supervisor is a different ethnicity or race from the supervisee, so they look at it in different sort of, coupling or from different lens. One is, like it says here, the supervisee is of color, and we'll have a supervisor who's white. And so what the literature says that a lot of times happens is that can be a difficult relationship, especially when there are cultural factors that come up to the surface through the work and potentially through the relationship with the supervisor as well. And so in the research show that supervisors of color experience more often than white supervisees on response to supervision in the context of having difficulty with the racial matter and being able to talk about that with their supervisor. And then white supervisees experience more discomfort discussion their own cultural issues one way or the other. It could be either with a white person or supervisor, or it could be but especially with the supervisor of color. That seems how to start that conversation. Students show these behaviors in the classroom as well. It's almost like, because you're so afraid you're going to do something wrong or you're going to be misunderstood. That's a big one. That you just do nothing. You don't say anything. You don't ask questions. You don't debate. You don't do anything. You just kind of lower your head and stay quiet. And so part of my job in those courses is to sort of not accept that, kind of nudge them. I obviously can't pull words out of their mouths, but, try to nudge them to take the plunge and sort of get their ideas out there, that all ideas are welcome, and that we're all on this continuum of struggling. I mean, we all have to consistently be vigilant of our own biases and assumptions. This is not a done deal, right? Just because you take a class or whatever. So all of us, myself included, I tell them, we all are a work in progress. And so as a result, we're constantly being challenged to grow. Then supervisors of color experience more ruptures when providing difficult cultural feedback to white supervisees when compared to white supervisors, which is really, it kind of makes sense when you look at it. Doesn't obviously, not everybody is in this situation, but it's interesting from the research perspective that this is something that we need to pay attention to, because it could be the assumption, well, because I'm not a racist or because I'm comfortable talking with race, that student's going to know that. Well, how is that student supposed to know that? Is possibly one area to think about. So then problems in supervision in these dyads will occur. It just seems common sense. When there's gender bias, is another one that we sometimes don't talk about. And that can happen with both men and women. It's not just men with men and women with women, or men, it could happen with any type of combination. I have worked with women who really were very misogynist. They didn't like women. It's like, okay. Very strong, and then because they had power, very intimidating. Or they viewed power in a way and used power in a way that became very intimidating to the supervisees. Then racial and ethnic microaggressions, which we're going to talk a little bit about what that is, microaggressions, which is kind of, it's been around since the 70s, I think. It's not new, but it's kind of more new in the conversation in the context of the classroom, especially, where using a lot of that term. Unintentional racism, not paying attention to a lot of nonverbal cues that people show and trying to understand those, and not misinterpret them, because the other thing we do, which is another area of cultural competency, is that because we come to the table with our own cultural lens, that we are interpreting behaviors in a particular specific way that may or may not be accurate. So the example that I use sometimes in the classroom is that if you are in a room with a Latina and her husband, and she lowers her and doesn't talk, doesn't always look at you in the eye, and always defers to her husband, if we were to use sort of just to show as an example, one lens that some people might use to say, well, she's passive because Latina women are passive, and he's dominant because that's machismo, and that's what Latino men do. So who knows what's going on there? She's probably feeling intimidated by him because has this power and control thing because of machismo. So you see what I'm going with? As we formulate this entire narrative on very little information, and what I can tell you for a lot of Latino women, and I tell this to the students, you would never dream of, sort of disrespecting your partner in front of somebody. I mean, that's just, that is not something that you do. And so it has nothing to do with power and control or anything like that. But by the interpretation of the behavior, we might be reading things that are not accurate. And so we stereotype, and we sort of misunderstand sometimes those nonverbal cues. So that can happen, and it's sort of important to explore in the context of your supervision, what is that about, and what led them to that conclusion, that their interpretation of those particular behaviors. So I'm going to take a pause. Any questions or comments so far? Yes?
I can think of an example of how our training doesn't always fit with culture. So in our training, self-determination is a real important value. But in a lot of other cultures, it's family determination is much more important. We have to do what's best for the family, not what's best for ourselves. And
that's a great example, and for sure that's one that I know that in my role as a clinical supervisor I work with supervisees on, because not students but social workers, because again, that interpretation, right? Now we try to spend a lot of time in certain classes to make students aware that there's a group orientation and there's individualistic orientation. And so a lot of developed countries like the United States have a very individualistic value orientation compared to many other countries and groups that have more of a community or group orientation. And when you have a group orientation, you're not thinking of yourself first. You really are thinking about the impact your behavior has on other people and how other people are going to perceive your behavior. And when you don't understand that, you're like, oh my God, this person is 30 years old and living with their mother. What's wrong with them? I mean, it's like the culture here in the United States and other countries is built that way. It's like, oh, we assume deficiency or something wrong. When from their perspective, why would I want to live by myself when I can live with my family? I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me to be by myself when I can have a built-in community, right? So intersectionality is the idea that people's identities are layered, and because they're layered, they're present all the time. So you can't forget that you're racially whatever, or you can't, you're experiencing your personhood in a holistic manner. Now, that said, some aspects of your identity are going to be more salient to you, probably because those are the ones that you are less dominant in. That's what commonly happens. Or it could be that you're most proud of, too. It doesn't have to be all negative. But for some people, race is most prominent, and even though it's not the most, important part of their identity, but it's the most prominent to their awareness because that's what gets sort of rejected or brought to their attention more in the social environment. And so the idea is that we intersect in this way bringing a social experience that's very complex. And so we don't want to look at somebody just as sexual orientation or just as race or just as class. We want to look at the totality of the person and how all of those factors are impacting the experience of that person. I'm going to turn this off, so it's not going to work. All right. The other thing that's important about this concept is that you can have different oppressions, or meaning that you're you're not part of a dominant group in some parts of your identity, but you may not be in others part of your identity. So maybe you're a white person and you have some dominance there, but then you're a woman and you have not so much dominance there. And it's so Audre Lorde said there's no hierarchy of oppression, meaning, you know, that we really, it's oppression. We're not gonna say that one is more and one is less, and so I beat you because I have more than you, because the experience of oppression is the same in that regard. Now that said, some people face a lot more barriers than others. So it brings oppression. People can experience both being the oppressor and being oppressed as a result of that intersection where we have multiple layers that some are more, could be privileged while others are not. And so we want to consider that experience of intersectionality, looking at them, that's part of the looking at the multicultural, through a multicultural lens. And we want to also look at how that intersectionality then is functioning within the greater social environment. Because that experience comes from somewhere, right? I mean, the good thing about social work as a profession is that we don't just look at the individual and their symptoms. I mean, we look at the individual, what they're expressing, but we also look at the environment and how they might be creating those symptoms, right? Because otherwise it's like blaming the victim when it's something that could be a reaction to, a normal reaction to something that's larger. So, so now we're going to go into some of the definitions, and I'm going to go a little faster because I want to also be mindful of the time. But so with microaggressions, this is a term that, I think it got created, it came up in the 70s, and basically it tries to capture the very small, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle. It could be verbal, it can be behavioral, it could be attitudinal, that are oftentimes informed by assumptions and stereotypes that we, not thinking, say, and then offend somebody in a number of ways. And so the other characteristic that's important about microaggressions is that people are not often aware that they're engaging that, and they really are very floored and surprised when the person who's offended says something, and you're like, whoa, I mean, where'd that come from? I didn't mean it that way. No, I didn't say, no, you know me better than that. I would never say something like that. But they did. And so part of what we talk about in the context of the classroom, and these are the types of microaggressions, is there's an expression in Spanish that says that I stepped on a toe, but it was dancing, And so what the expression means is that it was sort of not on purpose, right? I was dancing, and so because I was dancing, I stepped on your foot. And so, okay, so it was an accident, but if you think about it, you still stepped on my foot, right? That's a reality too. And my toes hurt as a result of you stepping on my foot. So yes, I can understand that it was it was an accident, but at the same time, you need to acknowledge that you did step on my foot. And so, so that's sort of the part of what the students are struggling with in the context of learning some of these concepts. So, so Dr. Daryl Sue talks about three different types of microaggressions, going from the worst kind, which is the micro assaults. And Laura and I were just talking this morning before the presentation started, that actually now, with everything happening and politically in our environment now, that we probably need to talk more of macro aggressions, because it's not just a micro anymore, right? It's communities and societies experiencing the lack of safety as a result of this larger environment being more hostile to them. And so those are the microassaults. The more when you think about active discrimination, that's the microassaults. And then the micro insults are the ones that could be a little more subtle. For example, implying that somebody who got into a really good school was probably there because of, special treatment of some sort. And that can be really insulting to somebody who really worked hard to get to where they got. And then micro invalidations are communications that these are the ones that I see the most, the micro invalidations. And these are totally by accident. And one of the conditions I said in the classroom when we talk about these topics is that we need to agree as a group, like the class group, that we are going to work through those. And that people need to feel free to express their mind, knowing we're all going to assume that that person is wanting to get feedback about that and learn from it without somebody jumping down their throat and, making them feel bad. Because that is not ally building, and it's really not useful for growth either. I mean, if you're defending yourself, you don't really open yourself up to learn if you're too busy defending yourself. So, so in this one, you are in some ways downplaying, negating, minimizing an experience from somebody from a group. So this is a very common one. Asian Americans that were born and raised here for generations, and they're still seen as foreigners. Where are you from? So these are some examples. Racial microaggressions: a white man or a woman clutches her purse or checks their wallets as a black or Latino man approaches or passes them. So the hidden message there: you and your group are criminals. We are bombarded with these messages everywhere we go. And so we are not immune to some of those effects of those messages. Gender microaggressions: an assertive female manager is labeled a B just because she's engaging in the exact same behaviors that a male manager would, except because she's a woman, she's considered a B. If it were a man, it would be considered being assertive and, confident and all of these things. And so that's an example of a gender microaggression. And then we have the sexual orientation microaggressions, where people who are showing some kind of affection and I think as a society we're ambivalent about any public display of affection, which is fascinating to me because I come from a culture where there's a lot of public display of affection. What's also fascinating to me as somebody who came as an adult to the United States is that it also varies by region. Like in the southern part of the United States, people are a lot more expressive that they are in terms of expressing affection and all of that than in the north. That doesn't mean they're not nice people, clearly, but it's just the way that express. And so definitely non-ambivalence about a lot of people looking at the affection through LGBT communities. That is something that people just have a very difficult time. And so the message to couples who engage in these behaviors and get that kind of response is that they're abnormal and offensive. And so other examples, like I said before, is when, when I talked about our privilege, a denial of individual racism and looking at yourself as just only as individual. This is very typical. I have black friends, I have Asian friends, I have gay friends, so therefore I'm not a racist or I'm not a homophobic or I'm not and so the message here to yourself, and that's what might impede growth, because that's the point of this conversation. Because if this is a narrative that people are engaging in, it stops you from then examining yourself and examining the experience of that other person, which of course is also equally important. So here the person's message to themselves is, I'm immune to racism because I have friends of color, so therefore that's not an area that I need to really work on. Color blindness is a very common one. Yes?
I was going to say that I think as people of color, we also have denial of individual racism, right? I'm of color, therefore I can't be racist.
Right.
And it happens all the time.
Absolutely, and we call it internalized racism, right? And there's all internalized isms, because when I worked, it certainly wasn't a big part of my practice, but when I did work with same-sex relationships, in some of them were individual, in individual modality, they were struggling with their own self-hate. right? And their own self-acceptance because of internalized homophobia. And so we get internalized racism, internalized sexism, internalized homophobia, et cetera. Because we're all getting the same messages, right? We're all part of this dominant group that sends, through the media. The media is a very powerful way that we all get exposed to multiple ideas about who we are, how do we compare to others, who are most valued, who are most beautiful, what does success means, etc. So when people who are offended or experience a microaggression, the place that they're in, and a lot of people of color can tell you this, the place they're in is, is this the time where I'm going to say something? Or is this the time that I'm going to let go? Or is this the time that I'm going to really teach them a lesson about, how wrong they are? Or I'm just so tired. I've been doing this all week. I don't want to do that. And then feel guilty and angry at yourself because you didn't. And that by not doing something or saying something, and this could happen to other people who want to defend people from those groups as well and defend against racism and all the other isms, the anger becomes, why didn't I do something? And what does that mean? Does that mean that I accept that I'm part of the problem? What does that mean? And so students struggle with a lot of those things as well. And so your role becomes how to help them work through that. And maybe even you sort of work through how you have worked through that and as part of your role. So the last portion of my section is to talk about the multicultural supervision as it breaks down into the different dyads. And so the way that this author looked at it was to look at the context of the supervisee development, supervisory role, supervisee-supervisor relationship, and the triadic relationship, which becomes sort of a triangle because it's the worker, the client, and the supervisor. And so we know through maybe, and you've been exposed to some of this literature, that there's a parallel process that happens in supervision of growth from you to the supervisee and the supervisee through you. You're also learning from one another and sometimes replicating things, because it's an interpersonal dynamic that happens between, in the context of this relationship, this working relationship. And so for the supervisee development, I think most of us, would agree when we think about helping supervisees grow. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. Okay. So when we think about their growth, we're thinking about their knowledge base of client groups, their knowledge of their attitudes that they bring to the table, and sometimes the attitudes that the clients bring to us too, right? Because the other thing I've worked with in my clinical supervisor role and with students is that people, they come to the, students come to the field because they're really excited, they're really motivated, they really have this very deep and passionate sense of service to improve our society. And then they're devastated when it's the client that rejects them, right? When the client is the one that says, you just don't get me, I can't work with you. And they're like left flustered what that means. What did I do wrong? What is it about me? About, et cetera, et cetera. And so it could also be on the knowledge and experience of how to manage that or how to understand those experiences in a way that's growth promoting for them. Bless you. So awareness of those attitudes, cross-cultural sensitivity. The word sensitivity ruffles people's feathers sometimes. I'm using the author's language here. Some people like competency, some people like responsiveness, some people like humility. Different words have been used. But the point is that you're aware, that you're bringing your culture, your idea of culture, your personal experience of culture to the table. And so therefore you're not neutral, you'll never be neutral. So then you have to be vigilant about how that assumption that you bring based on your experience, which is valid and is important, definitely, but how that informs what you do or what you don't do, right? What gets in the way of seeing certain things. And so we want to help students see that because they're not neutral, they can't really separate, say, well, this is my professional persona. Like it used to be in the old days that if you were a professional, you didn't express this, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. You certainly didn't, share anything about yourself. And there's still, some truth to that. We don't want that self-disclosure to be, like the order of the day, and be about you as students or you social worker. But we know through cross-cultural literature that self-disclosure sometimes does have a place, right? And we do know through cross-cultural literature that sometimes gift giving is something that people need to muddle with or muddle through in the context of work, of cross-cultural work, because the groups that give those gifts bring those gifts with a certain meaning. And to just discount them because, as a professional, I'm not supposed to be, there's ways to handle that that's culturally responsive. And so that's where our role as shaping future social workers becomes, how do we help, create the conditions so they can learn how to navigate those situations. So there's not a lot written about the supervisor role, but we do know that self-understanding, awareness, and continuing education like you're doing here is really key. And because you, of course, are in the position of facilitating that learning for somebody else. And so if you get it from where you're sitting, what it means to you, how you've managed this in your own practice with diverse clientele, then you'll be able to convey those meanings to them. But also, many of you might also have, in addition to supervising students, might be supervising other employees. And so it's a really good skill to have, obviously, regardless, because those dynamics are everywhere. We bring our intersectionality wherever we go, right? And so it's a useful sort of conceptualization to apply in your role as a manager. At least I found it to be very useful. So in the supervisee-supervisor relationship, we want to acknowledge that students, of course, come with that intersectionality of gender, culture, race, and all of those things. And so they sometimes, it's like with clients in the sense that we want to ask students what that means to them. So not assume that there's no meaning, and at the same time not assuming that it is. So one example that I bring to students is having a gay couple come to talk about parenting, and so the first thing, because that's the first most prevalent thing that people notice, is their sexual orientation, and so then the conceptualization becomes how parenting, the challenges of parenting because you're gay, when that might not be at all what they're coming from. Gayness in that context might not be at all the reason why they're there. That's sort of okay, actually. What is not okay is learning parenting skills. So again, those assumptions that we are responding because, again, it raises something for us, and because of our lack of neutrality. So one of the last ones I talk about is that triangle that I referred to, the power differentials in that triangle, the power differentials between the student and the client, between the client and the student, this client and the supervisor, and supervisee. And so in those power differentials, that's another area to be mindful of, because we are managers and supervisors are in a position of power, that what we say or do does have an effect. And so it behooves us to be even more aware of the ways that we might come across. And like I tell students, sometimes people are going to step on that toe dancing, as I mentioned earlier, but it's what you do after that, right? Is what you do to say, yes, I did step on the toe, even though I, was dancing. And so, yeah. Thank you for, do you need to talk about it further? What can I do about that? Can go a long way, and maybe that was enough for a lot of people, the acknowledgement. And so we want to talk about the personal development of each one of these areas. We want to talk about, or we want to look at and consider the importance of looking at the supervisors themselves and the growth that you need, the supports that you need. Sometimes agencies lack in this area. Like a lot of things are just dumped, and of course because of the fiscal climate that we're in, people are so eager to keep their jobs that they'll say yes to just about anything, right? Because we really want to be there for the clients in addition to have a job. but it's also important to think about what the needs that you have to continue growing, to be able to offer those supports that you want to give to supervisees. And then if you're focused on that, that's one area, but then the other focus is the growth of the supervisee, and in the relationship that you have together. Because even though it's a working relationship, it's not therapy by any stretch of the imagination, because there are boundaries around that. That's not your role to be therapeutic, which is another question that I get sometimes in the context of field instruction, especially when the students present with a lot of apparent mental health needs or other emotional needs. It becomes very tricky not to kind of cross that line, but it's really important because you're educating them how to manage those boundaries to not obviously cross the boundaries. So the last few slides are about the conceptualization. In competency, we look at these different areas of conceptualization, which is the thinking about it, how you approach it, how you understand it, how you pull together all the information and then form, if not interpretations, at least conclusions of some form of, in some shape or form, so that then should inform your next steps with that case. So all of these the conceptualization part is the area that I like to point out that's an important area to think about cultural competency and to be mindful about, because this is the area where a lot of us form a lot of assumptions, and how we interpret and how we understand behaviors, and therefore how we're going to intervene in those behaviors. So if we interpret somebody as being passive, then we're going to, I don't know, teach them to be assertive, right? When that could not be, might not be exactly what that person needs. So in terms of skill building and process, skill building seems straightforward. Learning, what to do when, and the timing of that. And then the process, of course, is the way you do that. And the relationship aspects, or the relational aspects of multicultural supervision, but also helping that person then implement some of those skill sets and learning awareness about the process that they're engaging in order to accomplish those skills. And then last but not least in this is the outcome evaluation, which is this, how do we determine that success has happened? And so that could also be very charged, believe it or not, and very politicized. In the context of domestic violence, it became very politicized because there was a very long time when the outcome, the primary outcome, the ideal outcome was that the woman had to leave her aggressor. And for the longest time, that was considered, the goal. And when even then we knew, but now we know more, I think widely, that leaving is probably the most dangerous time for the women to be able to address their situation. So leaving is actually not always the best option. But by funders and programs defining it that way, of course, supervisors sometimes carried out and clinicians carried out those kind of expectations. And so it's how to question some of those things based on the information that we're seeing on the ground. So it should be sort of dynamic that way. It's not just coming top down, but bottom up is also informing all the layers in the organization about things that you're observing on the ground that might not help you get where you want to go, which is to help people's lives. So my last slide is the different stages of learning and teaching cultural competence. Just sort of, like any stage, model or examples, they're not discrete categories. That's sort of the limitations of any developmental type of model. But it's just useful as a tool to look at. And so depending on how they sound, you can get a sense of where they are to sort of assess more or less. So if in stage one, the example is, I'm so embarrassed, I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. So they're really at a very basic step, if you may, in terms of cultural awareness or cultural competence. And the ideal, of course, is they will the more comfortable they are with their knowledge base, and through the experiences with feeling safe with you, to be able to have those conversations and muddle through with you, and through the conversations and the muddling through and the experiences they have with implementing your knowledge, the knowledge that they receive in the school, into the work with a client, the ideal, anyway, is that they'll feel more competent. But competency, again, is not an event. It's a process. It's a lifelong process that continues. And so one of the messages that we send over and over to students is this is just a time frame that they're here to learn some basic information, but really the real learning that never ends continues in the field. This gives them a good foundation to build on and build from. And so you all are very key in achieving that process. Thank you.
We're going to talk about gender variance. And when I was at Loyola, there was not even a class on LGBT therapy. There was a human sexuality class, and I was able to take that, but there was nothing talking about sexual orientation and gender identity specifically. And when I was in classes, I would wonder, I wonder how this affects lesbians or bisexual people or gender variant people, and there weren't really any good answers. We've gotten better since then. We are coming to understand sexual orientation and gender variance a little bit more. Socially, it's in our awareness. This dates me, but if you remember the 80s and you were around in the 80s, bisexual people were on the cover of Time. It was not for a good reason. It was mainly because Sharon Stone was a serial killer in a movie who was bisexual, but we became aware of bisexuality in the 80s. Gender variance is now something that we're becoming aware of in that way, that we're coming to understand that, like sexual orientation, gender does have a spectrum, that we aren't in an M box and an F box. And how we're coming to understand that is really changing. And it's very specific to how old a person is, right? So if you think about the way that we come to understand things and the age that I am, I did not know anything other than you could be a girl or a boy, but you weren't, there was nothing in between those things. For teenagers now, there is a spectrum of gender. People will come in and say, I am gender queer, I am gender fluid, I am asexual. They have all of these ideas and concepts around their gender that we didn't have before. So there's kind of a traditional model of how we have seen this, and now there's a more broader spectrum of how we are looking at it. And so it's coming into more of our awareness around how we need to help clients with this and how we need to be trained on it. I want you to be able to ask questions. So if you have questions about terminology or things like that, please let me know while we're going through things. So the reason that this is necessary is because in particular now, although I tend to feel like hourly our culture changes in terms of what a group of people feels targeted, whether or not it's about race or gender or class or a nationality. The big focus in the last 10 years has been around gender variance and someone who is trans. And the statistics are staggering. The main one that people hear about that is very true is that for someone who is gender variant, they have a 50-50 chance of whether or not they will be victims of homicide or suicide. The largest majority of people killed in hate crimes is trans women of color. And so we have a huge disproportionate amount of hate crimes that are happening around gender and orientation. And it's not something that we're all taught to talk about. We don't really know a lot about it. We don't hear about it. We don't understand it. And so it's such a hugely marginalized group. And trans individuals experience a whole host of issues because they assume, and rightly so, that the places that they're going to interact in are not likely to understand them. I have a really personal story about that actually, because my very first job being a new social worker, before I got my master's, it was when I got my bachelor's, I was working at a community mental health center, and it was my first intake alone. I'd been doing intakes with my supervisor, but it was my first one where I was going to be in the office alone with a client, and I was doing an intake to see if I could evaluate someone for therapy services. So the man comes into the office and he sits down with me, and it's a small room, and we got the 2 chairs, and I got my clipboard, and I'm making sure that I'm going to check off all the boxes and I'm going to know what I'm doing, right? I'm going to get the information. And in the middle of us talking, he says, "Could you stand up and turn around?" And I'm like, I looked 12. I was 21, and I looked 12. And I was like, "Excuse me?" And he said, "Could you stand up and turn around?" And I didn't know what to say, and he said, I need you to stand up and turn around. And he stands up and he starts taking off his clothes. And I go into my oh my God moment, right? Like, what am I doing in this office? Like, this is the first time, like, I'm panicking. And I run out of the office. And I run into the next office where my supervisor is on the phone, and I'm yelling at her. So she hangs up the phone on whoever she's talking to, and she comes into the room with me, and he's standing there kind of shocked because he's just, I left, right? And she sets him down, and we sit down, and we start talking. And she's asking him very nice, simple questions that didn't come to me at the time when I was trying to talk to him. And what she gets out of him is that the reason that he stood up was because he was trying to show me that underneath the clothes that he was wearing women's clothing. But he couldn't tell me. He couldn't tell me that what he wanted to talk about was his gender, because he had never told anybody before. He had never, ever uttered the words, and he didn't even know what to say about it. All he knew was that he felt more like a woman, and he never had heard of anyone who felt that way. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to ask him. I didn't know how to approach it. And what I thought was that he was going to do something to me. I thought, this is a man, I am a woman, I am sitting in an office, I am younger than him. He is one of those people who is going to take advantage of me. This is someone who is perverted or dysfunctional in some way. But he was scared, and he didn't have the words. And I didn't either. I didn't have the language to help him. I didn't know what to say. And I wasn't able to stay present with him in terms of what was happening. And that was my first intake. And I bombed it. And if I had had some sort of awareness, right, it was a perfect storm of things. Ideally, you don't want someone to undress in your office, although I have that happen a lot more now than I ever used to, and I'm totally okay with it. But ideally, we don't want that to happen, and ideally, we would be able to figure out what we're talking about, but neither one of us had the language, right? And he had never been anywhere that anyone had the language. I was living in the middle of central Illinois. I was not in Chicago. I don't know if it would have helped even if this was in Chicago at the time, because it was so long ago. And so I missed an opportunity to be able to help him and to be able to figure out what to do to kind of bridge this so I could sit with him in this and figure out what was going on. And this is the experience for most gender variant people. They are primarily discriminated against in large institutions. They know that their medical providers aren't likely going to be able to serve them. They know that they're likely going to have to educate the people around them. And they're fairly certain, for good reason, that they could be asked to leave because of how they identify. And so accessing any services, right, is almost impossible for somebody, because they have to either deny who they are, or they have to reach out and be afraid that they could be discriminated against. So the estimates around the general population and trans people, I think, are way off, because it means that people actually have to identify and say that they identify that way. And the majority of the people that I see when they first come in to see me would not be able to identify that way. They would not be able to say that. They say, I've had some feelings, I think this is something that's going on, I'm not quite sure. But I ask all of the questions on my intake, like, what's your sexual orientation, what's your gender, what legal sex, were you assigned? I ask all of these questions, and invariably what they fill out on their form and then what they come in and say in my office don't match. And so we're not getting good data on who this is. And I talk to hundreds and thousands of people about it all of the time, people who call from other countries and other cities and other states, and they're trying to find someone who understands. And so invariably you have a whole host of people who are not getting services that they need and are afraid to go anywhere. I want to give you some ideas. You have this guy and you have this person in your packet, and you should have a blank one. That's for you to do on the train on your way home today. You can just figure out where you stand in this. I want to give you an idea of the different concepts, because we usually look at people as we're boys or girls, We're straight or gay, and that's our identity. And if you don't understand the language that people are talking about, you can really miss what they're talking about in terms of how they identify and what they need. So what we understand, right, is that our sex, when we talk about somebody's sex, is usually the parts that they have. The boy or a girl is born and the doctor says it's a boy or a girl. But they only do that based on what the parts look like. If it's big enough to be a penis, you're called a boy. If it's small enough or too small, you're called a girl, right? But there's literally a ruler in a book that decides this. So it may match chromosomes, but it may not. So our sex, our legal sex, is about often the parts that we have, right? Our identity is our brain sex. People talk about their body sex or their brain sex. Our brains tell us our gender identity. They tell us who we are. So if you think about, how do you know that you're male or female? How do you know that you're a boy or a girl? How do you know that you're not either one of those? I try and figure that out a lot, and I'm like, I don't really know why I know I'm female. I know that I do. I'm not particularly feminine. I wore pants today. Does that make me less feminine today? And if I wear a dress tomorrow, I'm more feminine? Is that what makes me a girl or a boy, right? Is often we will look at our identities as the way that we express ourselves, and yet there are millions of people walking through the world who express themselves in a particular way, but their identity tells them something differently about themselves, right? So those things sometimes match, but sometimes they don't. And there's research that's been done that's shown that brains of male-identified people and female-identified people are actually different. So when you do research and they look at your brain, they can see someone who identifies as female has a female-looking brain, even if they were born assigned male at birth. So we know that our brains have something to do with it. We just don't know why or how exactly, because there's not a lot of research. So our identity is what our brains tell us that we are. That's our gender identity. Our attraction is our sexual orientation. Who you are attracted to is what your sexual orientation is, right? Your sexual orientation is attached to your brain, not to your body. So if you are, I was assigned female at birth and I identify as female, right? I am attracted to people not because of their gender. I have historically identified as bi, even though I don't identify with a binary actually, but I identify as bi. So gender doesn't really matter to me in terms of who I'm attracted to. So my sexual orientation is bisexual, right? For someone who was assigned female at birth, but has a penis, so they were assigned female at birth, they have a body that looks female. They identify as male, right? And they're attracted to men. Their sexual orientation would be gay. That make sense? So that's why you have the little sheet. You can figure out where you land on all this stuff. It's fun to do at cocktail parties too. People love this stuff. Your gender expression is all of this, right? It's all of what we do. What's interesting about gender expression is it's so culturally instigated, right? So we no longer think that men who have long hair are somehow sissies. We don't really think that it's an unusual thing for men to have long hair. We don't really anymore think it's really all that unusual for men to have earrings. But I remember when that started. That was when I was in high school. And I actually went to high school overseas, and what was interesting was for the kids, for those of us who were overseas at the time, you would pierce the right ear if you were male and you wore an earring, right? If you were straight. But if you pierced the wrong ear, it meant that you were gay. But when we moved back to the States actually had a different cultural expectation. So all the guys that I knew that pierced their ears, they had the wrong one pierced. And then they were being read as gay. So it's very culturally centralized around what is okay. We don't expect, for example, for men, someone who appears male, to walk into a room wearing a dress. In fact, it's typically used as a joke. It's like humor in some way. We would not find it a typical thing to do. But we don't think much about women and people who appear to be female wearing very masculine clothing, because we accept that femininity can take on masculinity, but we do not accept that masculinity can take on femininity, right? this is a whole other conference and class if you want to think about this, but my whole theory around this is that this is all in the hatred of the feminine. This is about our uncomfortability with femininity and how we see femininity as less than, which is why trans women tend to have more of a problem than trans men do. Someone who wants to be a male, we understand that. Of course you would want a penis. Who wouldn't want a penis? They're powerful. They do big things. But when a woman who has a penis wants to have surgery, most people are like, why would you want to cut off your penis? Why would you do that? Right? That's the primary way that we think of it. And so there's a lot of sexism that happens in gender issues. So when you're thinking about all of this, we used to look at it, like when this was first developed, we had gender identity, womanness, and manness against one another. They were the same bar, and they were against one another. So the idea was you had to be less masculine in order to be more feminine, right? And so it really paired them as opposites, rather than what we understand is we all have masculine and feminine traits. You might have this much femininity, but you might have this much masculinity, right? That they're very rarely equal in those ways. So I'm one of those people that can get labeled as aggressive in business places because I tend to be someone who will talk a lot. But I think if I were male, I would get read as assertive. I would be assertive in that way. I would not be aggressive in that way, right? And so this can be, am I more masculine or more feminine, or are these traits that I'm putting on these, you know, on this spectrum of trying to figure out, like, where do we land, right? What makes you more or less feminine or masculine? And this is true for all of these, right? So if you think about who you are sexually attracted to and who you are romantically attracted to, people will often talk about their sexual orientation. And the way that I explain it to people is most people, for example, who identify as female and identify as lesbians have had sex with men. But they don't identify with that sex. They could have had it, but they don't necessarily feel, it doesn't make them straight, right? So the idea would be that you can have sex with anybody, but it doesn't mean that you're attracted to them, right? You can, in my classes, I will say you could have sex with a stapler. It doesn't mean that you love the stapler. It means that you could have sex with anything. It is an act. But that act is not necessarily associated with attraction. And so you look at romantic attraction, and then you look at behavior, and you look at sexual attraction, right? For most of these things, like most people identify with sexual attraction or romantic attraction, but for asexual people, they don't. They will look at it and they will say, it's not really something that I identify with at all. I don't have attractions like that. I don't think of relationships like that. Do you have any questions about these terms? Yeah.
Just asking, I don't know if this is a ridiculous question.
It's not, I promise.
People that are born gay, in theory, based upon science, would you agree with that statement?
That people are born gay?
Yeah, when some people say that they...
You know, it's really interesting. The answer to any of those questions on whether or not we were born that way or we were made that way, I think is yes. I think ultimately that we will find out. We do know that there is something to sexual orientation and how we are born. So for example, it is more likely for in families like where there are like 7 brothers, right? So you have 7 biological children. It is more likely that the younger kids are gay. And the research, what it shows is that a woman, when she has a baby, her body will develop antibodies against testosterone. And so it's more likely that younger kids in a family will be gay than older kids will. Isn't that interesting? It's fascinating stuff, right? But yet, you can have an only child and they could still be gay. So it doesn't always have to do with that. So the answer is that yes, there is some ways that it is linked, but we don't know how. Just as much as that there are some ways that it is biologically linked around gender identity, but we don't exactly know how. We know that the brain is a powerful thing. We know that we don't know enough about it. But we don't know exactly what makes a person, right? We do know that we cannot create a person's identity. So if you've ever seen, if heard of John Money, and at Johns Hopkins. He was a doctor who worked, and what he said was that you could make a baby a boy or a girl, that gender was solely based on what you did to the baby, that basically it was a blank slate. But this happened with a particular person who, what had happened was that their penis was burned off. His penis was burned off in a circumcision accident, and he had a twin. And they did research on him to see if what would happen was that if they raised him as a girl because he didn't have a penis any longer. They didn't tell him that he was born male. They didn't tell him about the accident. His parents agreed to do this and to raise him as a girl. Ultimately, his whole life, the older that he got, he knew that he was male. And it wasn't until he was an adult that he found out that this had happened to him. And so what we do know is that you cannot make girls or boys. The way that I talk about it is, how long would we have to sit in this room for me to convince you that you weren't the identity that you know that you are? You're not really female, you're wearing pants. You look more masculine than you look feminine. There would be no way for me to do that, right? You know who you are, just as much as you know who you are attracted to, right? Even if you never have sex again, you will know your sexual orientation. You will know who you are attracted to. So we know that we can't create these things, but we don't know the answers to why.
We work with the prenatal maternal child population, and there are women that identify as lesbians or gay, and they want to have children, and they will choose to have sex with a male to have a child. A lot of times the case managers get wrapped around like how I'm like, that's her preference. Right now we just need to make sure the baby's healthy.
Yeah.
But they will identify.
In prison populations or places where it is very gender specific, people will have sex with the same gender, but it doesn't make them gay. So you will have men and women who will be in prison. They will have sexual relationships and sexual activity with people of the same sex. But when they come out of prison, they don't say, oh, I'm gay, and stay in those relationships. They typically go back to having heterosexual sex, right? Sex is a drive. Someone would argue, and I think I would too, if anyone's ever had a biological clock that ticks, you would argue that having a baby is a drive. The want and need to be a parent is a drive. So you will do what you need to, right? In order to do that. Yeah.
As a lesbian myself, I would have sex with a man to get pregnant, to have a child. I'm blessed with the resources to not have to do that.
Okay.
But if I didn't have the resources I have, I would. You know, to me, it's just a matter of state of mind. It's an act, it's penetration in your present, and
Or you're not.
I black out.
How many of you have had bad sex and thought I shouldn't have done that? Right? We've all done things that we wish we hadn't have done in the morning. So yeah, exactly. It's a thing you do.
Flexible. Like when we look at male involvement, I would say partner involvement because I don't want to leave anyone out. Some of the staff aren't comfortable with that, but if their partner is the same sex, should they not receive the same benefits as the
Exactly.
male? So I mean, I'm a little bit more liberal than some of mine.
It's a real struggle, and the struggle becomes, like, in talking about this, right, is that it brings up a whole host of things. We don't want to talk about sex, and it makes us uncomfortable, right? How many of you sit down before you have a sexual partner and say, we should really talk about what we're going to do here? What do you like? Let me tell you what I like. How many times have you done this before? Yeah, but you already know that you're on a spectrum that you had to figure that out, right? For most straight people, they don't have to figure that out. What you do is you have sex, you engage in a relationship, and you hope that it goes well enough that you never have to discuss it. This is why I have couples that have been married for 20 years and come in and say, no, we've never talked about sex, right? Is this stuff makes us uncomfortable. And we look at orientation that is not straight as being all about the sex, rather than all about the brain, right? When we think about what our brains do, we don't typically link that to sex. We think about what our bodies do. So, if you want to go know anything or more stuff about related to gender stuff, it's pronouncedmetrosexual.com. It's a wonderful site. Gives you lots of good info.
I remember hearing a term for situations where one can be sexually attracted to one gender and romantically attracted to the but those don't always.
They don't.
Sexual. So I don't remember the term now. But they typically go together probably, but not.
They usually go together. It kind of depends. All of the terminology that you're going to hear, you cannot assume that people are using it the same way. So transgender is usually the term that is current, right? The term that we used to use for transgender was hermaphrodite. Let me tell you, hermaphrodite is not a good term anymore. You don't want to use that anywhere. But you will see it in hospitals right now in Chicago. They will still use the term hermaphrodite for someone who is transgender. Some rooms do this. Do you want to figure it out?
Yeah, I'll figure it out.
So we know that these things aren't always linked, and what you want to talk to people about is how they identify. So I figured this out early on, actually at my internship. One of my internships is I was at Howard Brown Health Center, and I was starting a group for bi women. And they had never had a group on bisexuality. They had never done anything like that. And invariably, female staff would come and they would be talking to me about the group. And they would say, you know, I identify as a lesbian, but I have sex with men. It's okay. I usually do it when I'm at bars. Like, sometimes I'm drinking. It's not, you know, but it's all right. Sometimes I just like to. But they don't identify as bisexual or as heterosexual. They identify as a lesbian. So often labels are identity markers, they're not behavior markers. So this is true if you look at, how many remember when Oprah talked about being on the down low? Does everyone know what the being on the down low is? So it's typically a term that is used in African American culture for black men who have sex with other black men. These men don't identify as gay. They're not going to, if they have to check a box on a form, they're not going to write gay. They're not going to identify with the culture at all. But their behavior is gay. Their behavior is homosexual activity, right? But they don't identify with the term. But this is pretty common in black culture for men and women to not necessarily identify with a label of lesbian or gay, but that their activity, their mindset, their lives are around being gay or being lesbian. Where did that go? Okay, move away. Can you get rid of that somehow? How does that go away? Maybe, okay, there we go. Please don't try and remember this, but I'm just giving you this so you can understand. You're gonna have most people come in and talk about, most clients come in and use he, she pronouns, right? However, the younger the person, the more likely it is that they are going to say, I use it, or I use specific pronouns, or I use ni pronouns. There's a whole host of other pronouns that people use. And let me tell you, Google is powerful, and high schoolers have read it, so have junior high people. So you will have people who will come in, and you have young people especially, who will want to use different pronouns. And the language is really important. The reason that it's important is because there's power in how we identify people in language, and pronouns are something akin to oxygen. You use it, but you don't think about it, right? So it is a part of your language that is not something that you would consider. So if you think about how powerful this is, when you walk into a room and you look at someone, you immediately decide how you will identify them in your language. Right? What you will do, if the three of us are talking, eventually you're going to have to use a pronoun for him. And you're going to decide that he looks like a him, right? And what we're going to do with that. But we don't actually know if he is a he. What we know is you appear more masculine than you do feminine. But for someone who is trans, once you use a pronoun for them, they have to decide if they want to tell you. Right? And they have to figure out what you're going to do with that information. So what I tell students, and I tell other people to do, is to try and take pronouns out of your language. They aren't actually really necessary in terms of talking about somebody. We can have a lovely conversation and never identify a pronoun for a person, right? But people get really caught up in this, but it causes gender variant people to feel very othered and to wonder if they have to come out, right? This is how gay people feel when you say, oh, how's your husband doing? And then you have to decide if you tell me that you're actually married to a woman, right? And is that an okay thing to do? So if what you do is you just recognize how othering language is, it's pretty important. Those are some of the terms. That's just one umbrella. Trans is this big old umbrella, this one term that can mean lots of different things. Really, transgender is a way to say that someone's identification, identity, and expression of that is not typical for how we see gender right now. It's not typically male or typically female, right? But if you think about this, there's all sorts of ways that someone could be labeled under this, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to transition or that they identify as someone who was born in the wrong body. That's kind of the way that like the media will portray someone who is trans, is this idea that they knew since they were 4, it's always been this way. They look like a boy, but they identify as a girl, and they were kind of in the wrong body. That's a very traditional way to look at gender. But here's a whole host of other ways. Any questions? I know you have a lot of questions, but you could actually look them up. Wikipedia is really good for this. The reason that the work that you do is different for someone who is gender variant is the same reason why you don't and we can't treat women the same as men. We have now figured out, although they don't do much in this, that women have different symptoms for heart attacks than men do. That's kind of important to know, right? We cannot look at men as being the way in which we look at all people, any more than we can look at straight people as the way in which this is how all people are. And that for cisgendered people, this is how all people identify. Gender variance affects us just like any other identity marker does, and it affects our development. So for someone who, you can imagine, for example, if you appear male, but you were forced your whole life, just like this person that we talked about related to John Money, you were forced your whole life to live being identified as female, it would kind of mess with your mental health. You would probably have problems with depression. You would probably really struggle with why you felt wrong and why you didn't feel like you were really like other girls or other boys, right? And so it affects all aspects of a person. And if what you have to do is recognize that continually in what you're doing, you are always having to assess and reassess what's happening in your world. The way that I describe it a lot is that, you know how Barney, you have Barney costume, big purple dinosaur, right? Everybody loves Barney or really hates him. But invariably, he's supposed to be cute and cuddly and your kids like him, right? But you think about you being the Barney. You're in the costume, it's 90, it's July in Chicago, and you're walking down the street getting ready to go to some sort of kids' party where you are Barney. You're hot. The last person who wore the costume was drunk and puked in the shoes, and it's never been cleaned in there. You can't see, you have no peripheral vision because you're looking out of the nose holes, right? And you are trying to navigate your world. But everyone else is coming up to you and they want to take selfies with you. They think you're great. Oh my gosh, it's so good to see you. Let me take a picture. And they are thinking and reacting to you as if you are having as good of a time as they are. This is what it feels like to be gender variant, is that you're walking through the world and you feel like you're in this costume and everyone is relating to you as if you are the same as them, but you don't feel the same and you don't know exactly how they're perceiving you. They seem to feel like it's okay, but when do you tell them, yeah, I'm not okay. I don't like that pronoun, or I don't identify that way. Or actually, I look male. This happens a lot, like passing. When we talk about passing is something that's really a struggle for people who are trans, because passing means that a person looks typically female or looks typically male. And while it can be something that a lot of people aspire to, is to pass, it also means that they go back into a closet. right? So if you are someone who appears male, but you do not have male parts, and then you need to go into the hospital to have a pelvic exam, you're going to have an OBGYN that's going to look at you like you're crazy. What are you doing here? Right? Where's your wife? Why are you here? And then you have to explain that even though you look male, you need a pap smear, right? And so then people don't know what to do. How many people have heard of the standards of care? So the standards of care is the typical way that we understand. Harry Benjamin, the World Professional Organization on Transgender Health, developed a standard of care. And it's a guideline for people to understand how they should provide services for someone who is transgender, who is gender variant, right? A lot of people, mostly your clients, but a lot of professionals as well, assume that the standard of care is a law. It's like it has to be this way and it has to be done this way. But the standard of care is only a guideline. It is a theory. It is a way in which to look at, if I have a gender variant client, these are some things that I should keep in mind in terms of treating them, right? It's helpful in this way because likely you have never been trained on anything related to gender variance. Your clients have it, and I promise you that it's really unlikely that the agencies that you're working with also have any understanding of this. So the standard of care is often something that clients will come in knowing exactly what it says, right? And they feel like what they have to do is that in order to access services, that mental health professionals are kind of gatekeepers in this way for what they need to do. So there's this love-hate relationship. While it's really helpful to have a guideline because most of us aren't trained, it also means that there's this way in which gender variant people feel like they have to pass a certain test for professionals in order to meet what we see as what they need in order to get the services that they want, right? So it becomes a very gatekeeper type of relationship, which is difficult. One of the things that I see typically for places, because they are uncomfortable working with someone who is gender variant, is that they will use the standard of care as a way to say, I cannot treat you. I don't know anything about that, therefore I cannot provide you services, right? Now it's easy to see that in terms of someone who wants to access therapy, for example, right? We could think about, oh, I don't really know anything about gender variance, therefore I shouldn't see you. But this happens in very common places, shelters, schools, WIC offices, you name it, it happens anywhere in terms of people will say, because you are gender variant and I don't know anything about that, I cannot provide services to you, right? And sometimes the systems that are in place are actually the things that keep people from being able to provide services. You have to choose a sex or a gender, depending on how you want to look at either of those things, in a computer system to determine whether or not you can get services. So if you are a shelter for women, do you go with how somebody identifies, if they identify as female, or do you go with the fact that they have parts that are linked to being female? Which one fits for your level of service and for the funding that you get? How do you prove that, right? And what if the person has, because this is true right now, a person can have a driver's license that identifies them as female, but a birth certificate that identifies them as male? Which one do you pick? And so then what happens is that a person may not be able to then access those services because you have someone at that place, at that agency, who is saying, I don't know what to do with you, so you can't come in. We can't do anything for you. Right? And what this puts, the pressure that it puts on clients is the clients need to know more than the provider in order to be able to figure out how to get the things that they need, which for most people is pretty impossible. If you think about something that you've never known about, you don't become an expert in it just because you know that you are that, right? You have to learn those things. People often think about gender variance as it relates to transition. And usually people think about transitioning as a linear process where you have not transitioned, you do not know that you are trans, all the way to you transition and you end up over here and you're done, right? I explain this is going to be fairly common for most of the clients that you see, that they're going to have this idea that this is what they need to do. It's really misguided. It's a lot like thinking that when you come into therapy, you need to know exactly what you need to do at the end of it in order to be done. And we know that we don't work that way, right? So transitioning is more like an a la carte menu. You want to think of it as like tapas. So you have all of these possibilities related to transition, and you can do some of them. You could do all of them, but likely you won't, because most of them are connected to your socioeconomic status and the place that you live, right? So these are all of the different things that people could do in it, and then these are the processes that are connected to it. It's important to understand that, because if you have somebody who comes in to wherever you're at, and what they say to you is, I just started hormone replacement therapy, right? Which means that they are transitioning hormonally. You know, if they were born assigned male at birth, that means that they are stopping the testosterone in their body and they are starting estrogen. So their body is going to be estrogen based at this point. It's not going to be testosterone based. And it's helpful to understand that, because the effects of that are going to be physical and mental, right? So trans people are often misdiagnosed with all sorts of mental illnesses, because people will assume that there is something wrong with them and that there is a mental health issue going on, rather than recognizing that there is an adolescent developmental process happening. Puberty is happening, right? So often we will joke about the fact that adolescence is sort of like extended borderline personality disorder, or any other personality disorder, right? Like, you're going through all of these shifts, you don't know who you are, you're really labile, people don't like you don't like yourself, you feel terrible. Like, adolescence sucks in so many ways. Try doing it when you're 40 or 50 or 30, which is what a hormonal process will do to people. What that looks like in therapy or in mental health settings is a personality disorder or bipolar disorder. So you will have a gender variant person who will be misdiagnosed with mental health issues because a person doesn't understand, their providers don't understand that they're going through a developmental process that looks very different. So you have somebody, I have a number of clients actually who are over 60 who are transitioning. And what happens when they transition hormonally and when they start to live their lives is that they feel really good. And they want to go out and they want to socialize more. And so I have a bunch of 60-year-olds who are out at the bars partying, and they are not coming home at night, and they're having sex with other people, and they're not being 60. They're not being very grandparenty. They're being very college-agey, right? And they will say, like, I feel like something's wrong. I shouldn't be doing these things. Like, there's something wrong that I'm doing this. They're dressing inappropriately for their age, because that's what we do in terms of puberty, right? Like, I wore way more makeup when I was 13 than I do now, and it was bad makeup. But I was trying to find myself, right? And so what I did was I wore bad clothes, and I had lots of Aquanet in my hair. It was not good. And so there was all these ways in which I was trying to figure out who I was in that. There wasn't something wrong with me, it was normal for where I was. And what normalized it was that all of my peers were doing the same thing. But for a 60-year-old who is transitioning, their peers are not doing the same thing. Their peers are at home, turning off the TV at 9 and going to bed, and wondering why you're out and you want to go to bars and you want to do this, you want to date and do these things. So the transition process means that people look really differently developmentally. And that can look like there is something wrong rather than it being a normalized process. And clients will feel wrong, right? So the younger that a person is, the more congruent those things are, but it's not ever the same. And the reason that it's not the same, like, people always wish that they transitioned younger, right? That it would have been right if they could have just done it younger. But even for kids who are transitioning it younger, they are still in a primary culture space, right, that tells them that they're not doing it the right way, that there's something wrong with them. So you're building a lot of internalized transphobia and a lot of shame around the process, right, because they're not doing it the right way. So you want to look at all these different things and then be able to identify that all of these things are being impacted.
Two questions.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, with the hormone replacement therapy, is there a time that ever kind of balances out? Like, so they kind of stop being
Yeah.
the pubescent kind of phase of
Yeah.
hormone balancing? And then also, the second question is there a time that is too early to start hormone replacement? Like if someone is like 10,
Yeah.
you know, like and they haven't even hit puberty yet,
Right.
they want to do the transition, you know, like when's too early?
It's variable. It depends on where a person lives, their parents, and the person, and the healthcare that they have around them. So somebody who is 10 and lives in Nebraska doesn't have as much ability as someone who is 10 and lives in Evanston. It's very different in that way. What we don't know long term how hormones are affected in terms of what biologically is created. There's just not enough research. What we do know is that if somebody doesn't transition, there's enormously high rates for suicide, self-harm, drug and alcohol problems, mental health issues. We know that there's a huge amount of detriment that happens if someone isn't allowed to transition. Currently, the thought would be for medical providers who are trained in transition and in hormone replacement therapy would be that you would put a 10-year-old on hormone blockers to stop secondary sex characteristics, but you might not start hormones for a later time, right? So you would pause to where the body wouldn't develop, you know, as typical male or typical female, and you would give them time to sort of age a little bit to figure out if they really wanted to do this, right? What was the second part?
Like, so if they start hormone replacement therapies and they kind of
Yeah.
go through a puberty period, or like, is there a time when their hormones actually balance out and they kind of exit out of puberty, I guess?
They do. The way to look at it is, and the way that I will describe it to my clients, no matter what age they are, is if you think about who you were at 10 when you began puberty, you likely didn't even know that you were beginning puberty. Like hormones were happening, but you really weren't changing all that much, right? And then you were 12, and then maybe 12 you shot up, you had a growth spurt, right? There's all these like really subtle ways that transitioning and that puberty happens. You can use those terms interchangeably. In terms of a developmental process. There's a whole way that happens, and you can't see a lot of things. And then there's a bunch of things that happen that really kick in, and your body changes a lot. But who you are at 10 or at 15 or at 20 or at 25 is vastly different, right? So you think about looking at any pictures of you starting at 10 to 25 and how different you were in those stages. But you were going through puberty that whole time. Like you were going through your growth, moving from childhood to adulthood that whole time. So for someone who is transitioning, even at 60, they're going to have a number of years, right? A number of years where that will happen. It won't be like the same length, but it's significant because it takes a while for hormones to change in terms of what it does to a body. And estrogen cannot erase testosterone the way that testosterone can erase estrogen, right? So for someone whose body was born like assigned female at birth and is an estrogen based, when they start taking testosterone, testosterone will erase estrogen. It will not make breasts go away. It will not make breast tissue go away, but this is why most people consider that there are more trans women than there are trans men, is because trans men can disappear. Any of the number of you who are currently identify as female and are estrogen based, if you started taking testosterone and you transitioned, most people would never know. They would never know that you transitioned. In 10 years, people would not be able to tell. But testosterone can't be erased by estrogen the same way, which is why trans women are more visible, and we tend to think that trans women are a larger population than trans men. It's because they're more visible. So the testosterone changes the body, and it does things that estrogen cannot erase. It changes skin. Your bones are larger. You are taller. You are more muscular. Your voice is deeper. Your vocal cords will not like change, and it deepens, and your voice stays very deep. And estrogen cannot erase those things, right? It adds on. It will add on breast tissue. It will do things like that, but it will not take away the hormonal effects that testosterone has had for years, which is why it's so important, in particular for people who are assigned male at birth, that you stop testosterone early. The earlier that you stop those things, the more estrogen is able to take effect, and the more that people will feel more authentically female, if that's what they're going for. Yeah.
So earlier you said something about, like, when we were talking about tapas, and if there was access to all the options.
Yeah.
Is it that, do you think, or do we know if most people who identify as trans would want all the options? Or is there still a significant population that would say, oh, I could have all the surgeries, or I could do all these things, but I don't want it?
Well, the first thing is we always lack options. I don't know a lot about it, but did everyone see all of the hubbub around McDonald's and the fact that they only offered some sauce in some places?
Yeah.
People don't like it. They don't like it when they say you can only get this sauce on the south side of Chicago. You can't get it on the north side. North side people are like, I want that sauce. Why can't I have that sauce? Right? So we like the options. People want all the options, right? I don't think that if people had all of the options, like let's say everything could be covered, it was not a money aspect, I don't think people would do them. I think ultimately people would end up choosing a number of different things. But here's the thing about this identity shift is a lot of people will come in and they will say, I don't want to do everything. I don't think I want to transition. I don't think I want to do the whole thing. And usually by the whole thing, they mean go to surgery, right? They are looking at surgery as being the whole thing. And they say, I don't really know that I want to do the whole thing. But what I have found in my practice is that the more that people move to feeling more congruent, however that is, the more that they will choose to do things, right? So you will have people who will say, I will never do surgery, I don't want to do surgery. And then 2 years later, they're like, actually, I think I kind of want to do surgery. I didn't think I ever would, right? Because there's a way in which the congruency really fits. And that has to do with biological, physiological processes, but I also think it has to do with cultural processes. When you get affirmed in a way and the world sees you the way that you identify, and there's all of this camaraderie around fitting in, it's powerful, right? It's powerful around that. And so I think that there is more of a shift to do more things than what they think. You will have younger people though who are very much, if you think about identity development and how we get very activist oriented when we're younger and like changing the world, right? There's a reason why you don't have Take Back the Night marches at like retirement homes. We don't have the energy for it. We don't want to take back the night. We want to sleep. But you have Take Back the Night marches at colleges, right? Because we're very like, we have to take this back, and we are in this place of taking over our lives and wanting to have control, right? And so in that, there's this way in which you will have younger people who will be very wedded to a particular identity and will think that they aren't going to shift. And then they do, and they are surprised by that, right? You have less of that when you have someone who is older. There is a benefit to transitioning later. Most people don't feel like there is, but there is a benefit to living 40 years and then deciding something versus, deciding something when you're 18. This is why I tell my daughter she can't get a tattoo till she's 30. Intersectionality is so important in this because we understand gender and sexual orientation through the dominant culture. The dominant culture is male, the dominant culture is white, the dominant culture is middle class, right? Whatever you want to see that as, right? So the intersectionality of this is for a trans person who is not white, male, or middle class. they are really struggling with what does it mean for my other identities and how can I do this. So I worked with a black trans man for a while, and he said one of the things that had happened for him was that he early on knew that he identified as male, right? I mean, he knew very, very early that he identified as male, and he at one point saw a show on Phil Donahue. How many of you remember Phil? Phil was Oprah before Oprah was Oprah. And so he saw this show on Phil Donahue, and there was this man, this trans man that was on, talking about transitioning, assigned female at birth, identified as male and transitioned. And this was in the 80s, 70s, in the 70s. But he saw this person, and he thought, well, that's not me, that only happens to white people. This can't happen to a black person. So this must not be what I am. So it took him years to come to terms with the fact that he could be someone, that this was actually something about gender, and it was also connected to race. But he didn't understand that at first, because he was like, black people don't do this, because he never saw a black person do that. And so he didn't look at it as something that he could do, right? So you have to think culturally where someone is coming from, and why they see that as what they can do or cannot do, right? And because we look at this, we have judgments around what people do. And I came under that in a way that kind of surprised me at one point, because I had somebody call me. I was talking to them on the phone. They identified themselves as identifying as male, but they were assigned female at birth. So they identified as a trans man. And he said that he was really struggling. He wanted to talk about transition, but he was from the Philippines. His parents are Filipino. And he said, I can't transition until my parents die. So I don't want therapy to transition. I want therapy to help me address what I'm going to do for the next 30 years, because my parents are 50. And I think that they could live well into their 80s or 90s. So I need to know how to process how I'm going to live the next 30 years without transitioning. And in my head, I'm like, no, why would you do that? You shouldn't do that. That's wrong. You should do what you need to do. You should accept your identity. Very, very white, very privileged place of looking at it is individuality that matters most, and you should focus on this. And we talked about this earlier around this family, and how we look at what's best for the family and what's best for the individual. He came from a family. He was the eldest daughter. There were no other daughters. There was nobody else to take care of the parents. And so it was up to him, as the eldest daughter in the family, to take care of the parents until they died. And he was going to honor that. And he couldn't do that by transitioning. And so I had to really struggle with, could I do that? Could I work with someone and be competent enough in that intersectionality around ethnicity and race and, this idea of family versus individuality? And would I be the best person to work with this person, right? The struggle in that is often there's no choice. I don't have many people that I can refer to. So the thought that I would be able to find a trans competent Filipino therapist who could work with this person around both of those things was pretty slim. Even finding other therapists who are really gender competent is hard in general, much less throwing race into it. And so it was really important for me to understand that I had my own ideas around what this person should do. And I had to look at those biases and how it affected me. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is that often people think that this is true of students that I have when I teach LGBT therapy or human sexuality. They think that the idea, in order to be trans knowledgeable, is to be trans positive. That what they have to do is they have to accept everything about it. And that they must be positive in all of it, and they must celebrate a person's coming out and really encourage them to be out and proud about who they are, right? But that is just as detrimental as thinking someone should be in the closet. You can be positive without saying, oh my gosh, you need to celebrate your identity. You should go to these parades. This is what you should do. You should tell your family. This will be healthy for you. Because the reality is that sometimes people can't do that. And so you have to be really careful to recognize that you may actually be counseling your client to do something that is detrimental to their mental health, right? So, for example, if I know someone who comes in to see me and they want to transition and they tell me I'm in a really bad marriage, it is likely that if I transition that my spouse is going to fight me for custody, and I live in Iowa, I'm going to tell them that they probably should not transition. If they want to have custody of their children, they should probably not transition. If they live in Wisconsin, they should definitely not transition. Wisconsin does not have laws that protect people around gender identity, so they could lose custody of their kids. They could lose their job if they transition. You drive a few miles south and you head into Illinois. Illinois has better rights, and there is more protection. But it literally matters hourly what is going on right now. Like politically, what we have to understand is that in particular for LGBT folks, we have an administration that we know is impacting us. It's Pence's, it was Pence's platform to be very anti-LGBT. And so you really have to look at what is going on. So when they, one of the current things that happened was that they withdrew the ability for people to have non-discrimination laws related to federal employment and gender identity, right? Did everyone know that that happened? Yeah. Well, when that law went into place, I had a number of clients who worked for the federal government who transitioned. They transitioned on their job because they could, because there was a law saying that you could not discriminate against them. And now they are terrified that they are going to lose their jobs because their bosses know they transitioned, because they did it on the job. And so now, because the law was repealed, they're like, I'm not safe, what am I gonna do? And they're having to rethink everything. So this current administration, it comes to a daily check of where someone is living and what laws are in place to figure out. So when we talk about microaggressions are tiny compared to what now is happening in terms of macro. Like we're talking about enormous senses of trauma and danger around the fact that whatever is going on, socially, politically, societally, could really affect you. In mental health settings, every single person I see comes in and tells me a negative story about what happened with a mental health professional, about the way in which they were discriminated against. It's not some people, it is all people. It is all people. It can run the gamut of you are going to hell and you should do conversion therapy, to I don't really know what to do, but I guess we can talk about it, right? Which, if you think about how much you think about going to therapy, or if you have ever gone to therapy, and if you would choose a therapist who would say, well, I can talk to you, I don't really know anything about that, but sure, come on in. How comfortable would you be paying for that service? Would you really feel like it was doing something, right? Like, I have a black friend, we could talk, right? You're like, yeah, I don't know, thanks, right? Rather than feeling like someone really can identify with you. And so it is massive in terms of what we do, because we are a part of a systematic organization that discriminates against people within this population. And so it is not enough that you are okay. It is not enough that your supervisee is okay. You have to actually consider, is the supervisee's supervisor at the agency okay? Is the agency okay? What does the agency say about it, right? Like, how safe are they there? Because you can have a worker who is really accepting, like you may be great and your supervisee may be great, but their supervisor at the internship is really conservative, and they're going to say, we don't work with those people. You need to tell them to leave, right? And then you have a situation where a student is like, I don't know what to do, right? Because do they advocate for their client, or do they potentially end up sabotaging an internship? I wish this was an example that didn't happen, but it actually happens quite a lot. I could go on and on about all of the things that you could do, but these are some of them. Gender variant culture is just as relevant as race and ethnicity and understanding culture around race and ethnicity, right? It's just as relevant as understanding a person's faith and religion. So when we are talking about trans culture, we have a whole history of culture around gender and how it has been affected, right? And what has happened and the systematic level of discrimination around it, right? So you not only have to understand just what happens in a process, you have to understand the whole culture to really understand where someone is coming from. And you are likely working with a client who knows nothing about it themselves. So it's not as if they also, like we want to think, like we have this idea, right, that just because you are a thing, you are an expert on that thing, but you're not. Just because you have a race doesn't mean that you can talk intelligently about race. That is true because white people have a race too, and we do it very badly most of the time, right? Men have a gender, but they can't really talk about what it's like to be the other gender because they don't have that experience, right? So you have to think about, from a transcultural perspective, there is a whole way in which these communities have a system and have expectations, and there's all these ways that they are entering into a culture that they know nothing about and you know nothing about. And it's really important to understand that. We want to be able to tell someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. So we're really bad about this in queer communities. I'm pretty certain that I know when someone's gay. It's called gaydar. We talk about it a lot. And I think I have it, right? And yet, I never ever think anyone is bi. Isn't that ironic? Because I am. But I never assume anyone is bi. I always assume somebody is gay or lesbian. I never think of them as being bi. And I understand that if a man tells me that he is bi, somewhere in the back of my head, I'm really thinking, no, he's gay and he just hasn't figured it out yet. Because we do not assume that men can be bi. We do assume that women can be bi because we assume that femininity can be more fluid than masculinity, right? Yes?
I have a question. This kind of goes back to that idea of like systemically there's a lot of microaggressions.
Uh-huh.
What are your suggestions for either on an individual or organizational basis of when I feel like individually we do a good job of being culturally competent with gender, and yet we work within systems that aren't. So thinking about like we bill Medicaid, and so our electronic health record, our names for our members have to match their DHS, which has to match their Social Security, and so we aren't able to change people's names to the names that they prefer. And you know, I know that that's an aggression every time we bring out their treatment plan for them to sign that it doesn't have their preferred name on it, and just suggestions for things like that working within the system.
What you're actually talking about is a real macro aggression that has all tiny microaggressions underneath it. And because systemically, again, you can't file your taxes without picking a gender. You cannot get insurance without picking a gender. You cannot buy life insurance without picking a gender. I don't even think you can't get a gym membership without picking a gender. So it's everywhere. And then people have to decide which one is accurate. Do they tell you how they identify, or do they tell you what is in their pants? Because that's really what it comes down to, is what parts that you have, right? So in working with that, the very first place that I tell people to start is their paperwork. Because everyone lives or dies in agencies around their paperwork. So you tell your supervisee, or you tell the agency that you're working with, you look at their intake paperwork and you say, oh, it's interesting. I noticed that you don't ask sexual orientation on there. Is there a reason? Do you track how many gay clients you have versus how many straight clients? Like, why haven't you put that on your paperwork? Oh, I noticed that you asked for sex, but you don't ask for gender identity. Sometimes those things aren't congruent. You know, what about if you had a space for a blank for legal sex and gender identity? Like, would that be okay to change on your forms? You start asking questions like that. That it helps when you are not part of that group. If you have a trans Supervisee, if you have someone who is gender variant themselves and they are working within an agency, you cannot ask them to do that. The reason you can't ask them to do that is because the agency will see it as what they are doing for themselves, not what a client is doing. This is why we cannot, in spaces, often people of color don't feel like they can talk about race, because if you talk about race, you become the angry black person or the angry Hispanic. So it behooves white people to say, I wonder how this affects people of color. What do we need to do about that? Are we being racist in our hiring practices? Because we have the privilege to be able to talk about that. So for a supervisee who is gender variant, you cannot do this. But for everyone else who is cisgendered, you would say, you should ask. You should ask, why don't you do this? Have you thought about it? How many people do you serve? And what will happen is that you will get people thinking about it, right? And you bring them into the room. When I was at Loyola, one of the things that I would do is, I remember in my research class, for example, I would be like, I wonder how this affects lesbians. And everyone would look at me blankly, right? I did my research project on barebacking, and everyone thought it was on horseback riding. Barebacking is gay sex men when using no protection when they are HIV positive. But everyone thought it was on horseback riding. And the reason that I did it was because I wanted to bring it into the room. I wanted people to talk about the fact that there were other orientations and other people that we were going to be serving. And I could do it because I wasn't seen as that person, right? I don't necessarily feel, no anymore, I don't really care. But back then, I didn't really feel as comfortable talking about sexism. I wouldn't talk about sexism in that way because I knew that if I did, people were going to look at me and they were going to be like, oh, she's one of those women. Like, she's talking about that, right? When you are not of a group, then you can talk about the group in terms of minority status, and you can be the one to bring them into the room, right? So that is the first place that you start. You take out gender out of your language. So when you are talking about clients, you say, well, this person identifies as male. I haven't actually asked them their preferred pronoun, but I'll use he in this situation. And then people are like, what? Because they just, all of that went over their head and they're like, what? Or you introduce yourself and you say, hi, my name is Laura. I use she, her pronouns. And then everyone else in the room is like, why did she say that? Right? What is that? So you do it in ways where you just start to be inclusive. When you do it, you open up, first thing, other people in the room who want it to be that way are going to come to you and be like, I was so glad you did that. Thank you so much. And then the people who don't like it are going to be like, why are you doing that? What is going on? And you start to really be able to identify who are your allies, which is helpful for your clients and your supervisees. They need to know in those situations because the power differential, right? Like, you think how hard it is when you work with your supervisees around having them navigate the politics of an agency. Like, that's a huge piece of what you end up doing, right? Is helping them figure out where are they in this, because they are a lowly intern. And so if they see an injustice, what are they supposed to do with it? You have other questions about these things? There are always places that clients are going to have to educate you, and should, on their experience. But often well-meaning clinicians will say, well, I don't know much about gender variance, but I hope to learn from you. It's not a good thing to say. Imagine as a man saying to a woman, well, I don't really know much about women, but I'm hoping to learn from you. As a woman, I would be like, I don't know what that means, right? So be careful about being open in this way of it feeling like then the client has to educate you and that you're not going to do your own work, right? I don't really understand race, but I guess we'll learn from each other. It's not a good thing to say, right? How would you feel about going to your doctor and they say, well, I don't really know about cancer, but we'll work on it. You'd be like, yeah, I'm out of here, right? So this is a case study, and I put this up here so we could talk a little bit about what the presentation. And this is kind of a conglomeration of a couple of different people that I've worked with. So Michael, I want you to notice the language that I'm using in this, and I did it on purpose in this way, like how it reads. Michael's a 32-year-old Jewish person who he was assigned male at birth. And he came in and he was really, he was very well spoken. He's very thin. He was kind of very feminine in his presentation. And he works downtown as a financial analyst. He's pretty successful and had the job for a number of years. And he came into therapy saying that he thought he was a woman. And that was the language that he used around it. But he had so much shame around it. He couldn't look at me when he said it. He would rarely make eye contact. And he had, when I had asked him, because I ask everybody, you know, have you been in therapy before? He had said that he had just recently ended therapy because the therapist that he had been working with had told him when he disclosed that he thought maybe he was a woman, that she really thought that he should focus on getting out and dating more and find a nice woman to marry and have kids. And while that seems for a lot of people who would think, wow, that is like dangerous advice, right, around sexual orientation or gender, this is a really common scenario that I hear from most of my clients, that they have gotten the message that they are just focusing on the wrong thing and they should just get married and it will take care of themselves. So you have people who are coming in and what they do is they immerse themselves in a relationship, which is easy to do in our culture, and they just think it will go away. And then they are coming in 20, 30, 40 years later, and they are struggling with the fact that they are deeply depressed and they don't know what to do. So this was what he was talking about. And he was so ashamed of what he was doing that he had cycles of binging and purging clothing, which is pretty common with people. It's not common for male-identified people, so for people who trans men, because women can, female-born identified people can wear masculine clothing and it's not seen so outrageous to us. But for people who are assigned male at birth, the idea of having female clothing is really shaming. Wearing dresses, looking like a sissy, you know, all of these things. And so he would buy clothing and he would hide it and he would dress every night in his apartment, but he would never go out. And he described to me at one point standing at his door, and he would do this every night and he would see how close he could get to the front door to see if he could walk out of it. And he never did. At the time that he came to see me, he would get about 3 feet away and he would spend hours standing in front of his door, fully dressed and, you know, makeup and hair and the whole bit, and would never leave. And he had done this for years. And when he got really, really uncomfortable with it, he would throw away all of the clothes, and then he would not do it, and then he would buy all of the clothes again and all of the makeup again, and he would do this over and over and over. And he never told anybody. And he was really struggling with her advice because he kind of thought that maybe she was right. Like, he had been in a relationship before with a woman who wanted to date him, and that maybe he should do this thing. Maybe he should just get over it, right? This next scenario is quite common now too. He had a very active online life. Online, she was Monica, and Monica was really successful. She had lots of friends. She hung out in online spaces. She was supportive to people. She dated people online that she had never met. And so, you know, the dating online consisted of them talking on a regular basis. They were partnered with other people that they knew online, like people knew them to be partnered together. And so she felt really comfortable online. And she had, you know, had a name, and that she used this, and Monica was very separate from Michael. Michael was really felt very disempowered and very powerless in the situation, and Monica was really effervescent. And she would change when she talked. When he talked to me, when Michael talked to me, it was very different. He was very removed. He wouldn't make eye contact. When we came to start, when I understood that Monica existed, Monica was really lively. She would make eye contact with me. She would talk about the things that she liked. She had hobbies. She had relationships online. People knew her. I've had many people tell me that when they came in, they had therapists who diagnosed them with dissociative identity disorder because of this situation, because of what they were doing. He was not disassociated. She was not disassociated, right? But he couldn't be who he knew he was because Monica wasn't allowed to exist in his world, right? I'm switching on purpose in terms of how I'm identifying this because this was how his presentation was. And Monica's life was very different. Monica existed and she was doing really well, but she couldn't exist outside of the online, right? And so he had decided that as Monica would go out on a date. And so he had done this. Monica went out and she met somebody at a coffee shop. And most people, when they hear this, they talk about whether or not he passed well, because this is sort of important in us understanding the story. And he did. He looked like Monica when he was Monica, right? She was not someone who looked typically like a trans woman. So this idea of a man in a dress, she did not look like a man in a dress. She looked like any other woman. And so, but she was scared and knew enough to know that when she went to the coffee shop that she needed to disclose something because she knew that people got killed when they went on dates. This is very true. If you had to decide to go out on a date, or is tonight the night I want to die, you would not date, right? So for most trans people, they are so afraid that they will not date because it is really a life or death situation for them. They could die. They could be killed. So she did what she thought was the right thing, thinking about this person that she was going out on a date with, and she told this guy, they were sitting at Starbucks, and she told him that she was trans, and he hit her. They were sitting in the middle of Starbucks, and he hit her so hard that she flew across the room, took out a couple of tables, and broke her nose. And so she came in and she was all messed up. And so she had decided that was it. She was not dating anymore. And what we would normally want to do is be able to talk about how this is a random event, how this shouldn't happen to somebody, how it's not likely to happen again, and that there are bad people in the world, but there are more good people in the world. All of the things that we would say to someone, and we would encourage them to figure out how to move forward in their lives. But the reality for trans people is not quite so simple. The reality for her really was talking about how it might not ever be different for her. It might not ever be different. She may never get to the part where she would be able to do that. And likely, when she went out on a date again, it would happen again. So it's a very different presentation, right? And Michael came from a situation, so looking at the intersexuality of something, Michael came from a family life where his parents were really, they were very rigid and they were very controlling. And he had often liked to play with his mom's clothes. The only time that he really found his mom all that affectionate was when he was playing with her clothes and she would play dress up with him. But when this happened, and his dad would come in, like his dad would find them at different points, and his dad would become enraged. And so then his parents would end up fighting about it, and his dad talked a lot about how he was gay, he was a sissy, he was a pussy, there were all these things that he would call him. And so he had this history of this traumatic childhood, right? So you think about the layers of these things, and then we're thinking, well, is that the reason he's trans? Is the trauma the reason he's trans? Like maybe that's it. Everybody goes there, no matter how much, like you don't want to. But the thought process around that is the same as saying, oh, a woman was raped, so therefore that's why she's a lesbian. She's not really a lesbian, she's only a lesbian because she was raped. And if she just found the right man, then she would be okay, right? We tend to look at previous trauma, and by we, I mean therapists and social workers. We tend to look at previous trauma and assign it to something that's going on in someone's life right now and think that's the cause of it. And because we look at gender identity as being less than, that if you are transgender, it is not a legitimate orientation like cisgender is, we will think, oh, that must be the reason that it's happening. If they work through this trauma, maybe they won't want to be a woman so badly. Right? So this is a fairly common mistake that people will make around focusing on the trauma in a way that negates the gender identity piece of things. Does this make sense? Okay. Understandably, you can imagine that Michael was really paranoid. He had a hard time. He wanted to know how safe he was. He made poor eye contact. He seemed really suspicious. At one point, he asked me if I recorded my sessions or if I had any videotape, like any security cameras around my office. He wanted to know these different things. Part of the reason was because we would talk about whether or not Monica was going to come to therapy. A big part of working with people around gender identity, and if they are transitioning in this process, is if they don't show up presenting their identified self, at some point the conversation comes around to how is their real self going to show up in therapy? Because if they never do, you're not actually doing the work. Like, it's not happening in that way. And so we would talk about this ability for Monica to be present. Like, how would Monica be able to be there? Right? Would she actually, like, would Michael have to come to the appointment, and would Monica have to dress there and then come into the office, right? So this is where people undress a lot in my office, is I have extra rooms where people will go in and they will change and then they will come into therapy. And so the symptoms, the things that he presented, looked paranoid. And he said he had been diagnosed with a personality disorder, and people had asked him at different points if maybe he had a mental illness like bipolar or schizophrenia, right? And so I could tell that from what he was talking about that this was because he did seem very paranoid. But paranoia for an LGBT person, not just a trans person, but paranoia for an LGBT person is actually safety, and it's very real, right? It's the same level of, like, most of the time when men go to their car and they get in their car at night, they just go in and they unlock and they get in their car and they drive away, right? The first thing that I do when I go to my car at night is I look in the back seat. Why? Because my mother taught me that if you don't look in the car, there could be some man there that is getting ready to assault you, and you have to be careful. You have to have your key out at night walking through the parking lot, because you have to make sure that you can get away from someone and you can attack them with something. It sounds very paranoid to men, but for women, we understand what this means. I understand that I can't walk in particular places at night because if I am alone, I could be in danger from that. LGBT people understand that their level of safety has to be really, really heightened. And for those of us who don't understand it, it can feel very paranoid. And so this is something too that we had to deal with, was this idea that, yes, he was very suspicious, so was Monica. And what were we going to do about that? Because the reality was that we were in a culture that was not going to accept Monica the same way that ideally we would want someone to be accepted. Oh, that's cute. Did you put that graphic there? Nice job. Love co-presenting. People do other things that you don't do. So, questions, in the 10 minutes that we have. Are there other things that this had prompted for you? What are some things that you think about in terms of what you're working on with your students? Yeah.
Something I noticed in the presentation was having respectful language, like having a foundation of language.
Mm-hmm.
But I struggle because I feel like it's different. I'm in two different settings, in two different schools,
Mm-hmm.
and what one building of kids uses respectful language on these issues, and what the other
Mm-hmm.
is not the same. So I can't say, like, my one building, I could be like, oh, genderqueer, and the kids are like, and the other building, if I said that, that would not be okay.
It would not be okay.
And so, like, that line of, like, not making my client educate me, but also not being able to know the micro
Yep.
culture, like, there's just no realistic way.
No. The best thing is to ask really open-ended questions. So you ask clients what labels they give themselves, like, how do you identify? And you let them say whatever it is, right? And then you ask them, well, what does that mean to you, right? It's really, really good. That is not a thing that is seen as I'm educating you. It would be like a lot if you said, I'm Christian. And I might say, do you attend a church? Did you grow up Christian? Like, there would be questions that I would ask to try and figure out what does that mean to you, right? So you would ask about those languages and the way that people identify and figure out what does it mean for them. You also really think about behavior, right? And so behavior becomes something like, if someone was going to talk about being gay, for example, you might have a kid who would say, I'm gay. And you would say, okay, tell me what does that mean for you? And they would be like, well, I really like men, and I identify more as gay and identify more as queer. And then they might say, and then you might ask about behavior. Well, are you dating somebody? Yeah, I'm dating this girl. And then you're like, but you said you were gay, right? And so you start to talk about what the behaviors and why, how it fits for them, and to ask those things. Because the language is constantly changing. You could Google things just before your client came in, and I promise you they would come up with something else that's very different, particularly if you have a teenager. There's a big difference in language. And it's really culturally very different. The words that are used on the south side are different than the words that are used on the north side, right? And so you would really have to talk about what was going on and how they identified in that way, and really look at, again, the intersectionality between these pieces. When we talk about this, we talk about it under the majority lens of whiteness, right? But there are less words in other languages for sexual orientation and gender identity in a way that the language is not the same, and so they may never talk about it. So for examples in family dynamics, white families tend to disown children, and families of color tend to not accept it, but don't talk about it. So they move to a don't ask, don't tell policy, right? So you will have more families of color that will go to a don't ask, don't tell policy, and more white families that will go to a you have to get out of here, I can't handle you, and they will disown. And so there may be times where what you find out is that a kid has been out and everybody knows, but nobody talks about it. And you would not talk about it. You wouldn't encourage them to. It would not be something that you would do, right? So you have to look at sort of the intersectionality of those pieces. But the language piece is really important. And then the cultural piece is looking at what's out there from a gender identity standpoint, right? Will and Grace came back on, right? And for my daughter, who is 11, she has no idea who Will and Grace are and doesn't care. And yet we've been talking a lot about how Will and Grace was really informative around how we came to see gay characters online and on TV, and what we saw in that way, right? And so you kind of have to think about the cultural pieces that are happening right now. So a lot of that is YouTube. YouTube is a whole host of information particularly for your young people who identify as gender variant, and they're getting lots of wrong information. So you should go on there and learn the wrong information, because you're going to get a lot of stuff on there, and it's going to be able to help inform you currently what people are doing. So this is such a small piece of things. Please feel free to get a hold of me if you ever have questions. If you have your supervisees are dealing with something, your clients are dealing with something. We will add it to the PowerPoint in my email. And so if you have questions about things or you're looking for referrals, please let me know, and I will help you find information. Thank you very much.
Thank you.